All right, so I'm Dr. Aaron Wagner. I'm really privileged to be here among fantastic colleagues, and I'm thrilled to have so many people from the campus community here to participate in this conversation. So full disclosure, I'm a staff person in the graduate school. I want you to know that today I'm speaking as a scholar and as a contributor to our religious studies program, and not speaking on behalf of the graduate school. You can quote me on that. All right, so I'm sure that many folks right now are talking about religion in the context of community, faith, and resilience, right? We could talk about how Black churches fostered survival among the communities who experienced slavery. We could talk about how Quakers were some of the first people to advocate for the abolition of slavery, and they did so very much articulating a religious and deeply faith-driven perspective. We could talk about how today we have religious communities, we have religious centers and mission churches that function as the centers of communities among indigenous communities, right? For example, the Tiwa, for example. We could talk about liberation theology. We could talk about the Comunidades de Base. We can talk about their work in the face of US imperialism, Operation Condor, and dictatorial violence. We could talk about Reform Judaism's essential role in the advocacy of civil liberties, protections of civil liberties in this country and elsewhere. We could talk about healing and hope in times of darkness. But I'm not. I want to give this sort of caveat that I acknowledge all that stuff. But here, I want to push us a little bit to think about how often, perhaps more often, religion has functioned to fuel and perpetuate violence. So, for example, Black churches also functioned as centers of control and surveillance for enslaved peoples. We could talk about, as was alluded earlier, how some denominations in the United States literally split. Those southern denominations split from northern ones to defend and perpetuate the slavery of African Americans. We could talk about the KKK, as Dr. Bench alluded. It not just was, it is a Christian organization. We could also talk about how US Christian nationalism informed things like Operation Condor, disappearances, really awful, terrible stuff in Latin America. We could talk about how John Paul II, when he had the opportunity to advocate in the support of liberation theology and oppose things like Operation Condor, instead he told the nuns to go home and pray. We could talk about how Christian and Catholic, Protestant and Catholic settler colonialism devastated indigenous populations in the name of evangelism. And of course, we could talk about how Christian anti-Semitism, often, the Nazis like to use Luther, they trot out Luther to support anti-Semitism, and in many ways inform the Holocaust, right? So I want to lead you to start with the question of how positive, how we put this on balance. Unfortunately, the historical review is not so positive. But gosh, how am I defining positive to begin with? Let me note that when I'm doing this sort of balance in my mind, and that's sort of a question in itself, how do you define this, right? And so I would say that what extent does the religious ideology foster justice, peace, sustainability, and responsive representative forms of government? That's sort of my definition. You may have heard other people talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so with that said, I don't think that anyone would deny that we face huge challenges right now. We face white supremacy, we face burgeoning nationalism and militarism, we face environmental degradation, we face a fundamentally unsustainable and unjust economic order. I don't know about y'all, but I have these days where I wake up and I'm like, how do we even start to address these things? And my initial response is that perhaps big history might allow us to step back, look at the challenges facing humanity from a very longue durée, and essentially this is the idea that big problems require big perspective. Like, we have to step back and think about, especially things like environmental problems. We can't measure environmental problems from one year to the next. Yeah, it's really hot. It was really hot, right? But when you look at that, you place that in the context of hundreds of years. It's still really hot, by the way. But having this sort of 100 and even thousands of years perspectives on these big, big challenges is an essential way that history could inform ways to address these problems. And also, just a little note, anti-racist education, feminist curiosity, radical hospitality, and broad-based community organizing certainly cannot hurt. So let's talk about some religious ideologies that are fundamentally counterproductive. I'm going to argue that we call shenanigans when we see them. So when we talk about healing and hope in times of darkness, that's great, but we need to think about solutions. And I would say that healing and hope are only useful to the extent to which they allow us to survive the present moment long enough to overcome the problem at hand. So I heard some of my colleagues earlier, including Dr. David Romo, and he was like very skeptical about this whole El Paso Strong thing. I have to say that I echo his concerns. So, what are some ideologies that we might find problematic? Sometimes we find it much easier to identify problematic ideologies when our nationalist agenda has defined them as the enemy. I think that it was Dr. Bench who noted the enemy within and the enemy without. Is that right? Maybe? Did you mention this?
No, I didn't.
Somebody
we
did.
Talked about the idea of education is the bad guy, right?
Okay, yeah, but someone mentioned, it may have been Dr. Romo, the idea that there's the enemy within and the enemy without. We're very quick to note the religious ideologies of the enemy within and especially the enemy without, right? Especially things like Islamic terrorism. And of course, when it's quite bloody and violent, it's pretty easy to name. But I would challenge us to, we'd also maybe think about, we can see nationalism in places like India. Hindu nationalism is on the march. Places like Myanmar, Buddhist nationalism, I never thought I would imagine such a thing, but yeah, it's on the march. And so a variety of ideologies, a variety of religious backgrounds are currently being used to fuel very dangerous political developments. So I would ask us to take a second and note some perhaps dangerous and facile ideologies here. So I'm not going to tell you first where they're from, but I'll tell you they're both mainstream Christian ministers. The first one, my hope is not centered in this world or in what man is going to do or not going to do. My hope is centered in the person of our Lord Jesus Christ, in going to come back someday and straighten the whole mess out. So let's not stress about the huge problems facing us. Let's just wait for Jesus to come back. Okay, I would say that that's quite dangerous. Next, God delights in prosperity. He wants to do something supernatural and new in your finances, even now. But it's up to you to perceive it and know it. You do that with your faith. No one else can do that for you. Receive God's word into your spirit by agreeing with God, and then you can expect God to move in your finances. I would argue that #blessed is also incredibly dangerous because it obscures like major systematic problems. Poverty and inequality are structural problems that we have to look at with honesty before we can address them. So yeah, the first one is from Billy Graham's website, and the second is from Joel Osteen's website, of course, yeah. I gotta say, he's got great hair. Terrible theology, but great hair. So those are the nice ones, though. So those two that you just saw before, those are nice ones that we see floating around in mainstream, and we don't call shenanigans enough when we hear them. I would argue that there are other ones that lurk just below the surface that are even more dangerous. We've got this whole bubbling thing about white Christian nationalism, a white Christian West that is responding to invasions by people of color, particularly Muslims and immigrants. It is religious in nature, right? I mean, people like Pat Buchanan were writing in this really nasty way in the 90s, right? This is not new stuff. It's not new stuff, but it has been lurking just beneath the surface of our public consciousness, and it has emerged like in Jaws, you know, the fin, right? We also have an apocalyptic evangelical Christianity that obsesses with the end times, even to the extent of creating self-fulfilling prophecies. The move of the embassy in Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, that really wasn't about politics or operation. That was a dog whistle to the people who think that doing that is going to hasten the end of the world. Okay, talk about counterproductive religious ideologies. And I think, well, the problem with that one, that last one in particular, is that, you know, if you think that militarization and certain geopolitical changes like China or Russia are sort of preordained in the book of Revelations to serve some apocalyptic role, if you believe that and you allow that to shape public policy and diplomacy, that very well could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So gosh, how do we address these things? I mean, there's plenty of folks who are arguing that we need a more justice-oriented Christianity. Let's see, I've got some examples here. Princeton theology people had this big thing, this big sort of seminar earlier this year, and that's what they concluded, is that essentially Christians of conscience need to rise up and advocate for a kind of Christian approach that is filled with justice. That's what they say. Obviously, we've got people like James Martin, who is fighting the good fight on social media. He's a Jesuit, he's a Catholic. We've got the nuns on the bus, right? Some nuns are doing some cool stuff. Of course, there's also a lot of folks who are arguing that we have to move away from these deeply religious values and embrace a more secular approach to our public discourse. There's people like Dawkins who are pretty enraged and have been talking about this for a while, but there's also some new things happening with the Satanic Temple, for example. The Satanic Temple is using religion and tropes around religion to bring about the kinds of legal and very pragmatic public policy things, right? I would say perhaps both. We also know when we think about, for example, looking at research around radicalization of Muslims, we know that channeling those folks into more peaceful iterations of faith is more successful perhaps than squashing faith, right? So if anything, from a functionalist perspective, having more progressive versions of faith that are advocating around peace and reason, might help to dissuade folks from those more dangerous paths. I'll conclude by saying that we need to be cautious of uncritical, simple answers, platitudes, and distractions. We saw that the mayor of our great town, the week before the tragedy, the white supremacist attack, he spent the week before talking about Antifa. That is a distraction. It is a lie. It is a smokescreen. The attack that happened was a white supremacist attack. And we need to constantly examine structures, assumptions, and ideologies. Thank you very much. We'll take questions at the end.